This is Lindsay Albertson, Assistant Professor at Montana State University. In this section, we're going to discuss fluvial geomorphology. Fluvial geomorphology is a term that combines three major parts: fluvial, which means running water, geo, which means earth, and morphology, which means shape. So taken together, fluvial geomorphology is the study of landforms shaped by running waters. And this research field is really important because fluvial processes are dominant forces that shape our continents and our Earth's surface worldwide. The geomorphology of rivers varies across Earth's surface, and we use broad categories to describe general patterns in the type of rivers and processes that are important depending on where you are on the landscape. Zone 1, which is shown here, is the headwaters, where the land is relatively steep or sloped steeply, water is moving relatively fast, the valley is V-shaped, meaning it has high and steep walls, and rapids and waterfalls are common. Zone 2 is the transfer zone, which is shown here. That's categorized by relatively shallower slopes, lower elevation, the water is moving relatively slowly, and the valley begins to widen out so that the river can begin to meander or create what we call S-shaped curves. And finally, zone 3, which is the depositional zone, occurs at very low elevation, where the valley is very broad and almost flat so that there's almost no slope to the river. The water's moving relatively slowly, and eventually you may even form very wide meanders, which are shown here, these large S-shaped curves, or multiple channels. Across these different zones, you have different flow rates and sizes of a particle or substrate on the stream bottom. So this diagram shows you via the arrows what the typical flow rate is, where you have a high flow rate in the headwaters and a relatively low flow rate at the depositional zone. You also see a pretty important transition in the particle size as you move from headwaters to the depositional zone, from large particles on the stream bed or the river bed in the headwaters to relatively small particles, things like sand, as you move into the depositional zone. The substrate has potential to be transported or moved as a function of the water current, the slope, the contribution of the valley nearby, and other conditions. Sediment transport is one of the primary physical habitats that we think about as having potential to be influenced by ecosystem engineers. Okay, so this is one of the response variables that's potentially important for how ecosystem engineers affect the physical abiotic habitat. In this diagram, water flow, or the stream current, is moving from left to right, and we've got three different groups of particles that have the potential to be moved here. The solution load, which is shown here, is considered the dissolved load, very, very small particles. These are things like nutrients. We've got the suspended load, which are slightly larger particles, things like coarse particulate organic matter or fine particulate organic matter. So this would be the food that caddisflies, net spinning caddisflies, are eating, for example. And then the final group here is the bed load. So these are the particles on the bed that are too large to be suspended up into the water column, and instead they move by rolling, or a process that's called saltation, which essentially just means that those particles are skipping along the bottom of the river. Let's take a look at what that actually looks like. So you can see these particles are just sort of skipping along the bottom. They're not floating up into the water column. They're rolling in short bursts, then they stop, and then they roll again. And this is what we typically think of as the bed load or saltation for particles that are moving along the bottom of the river. Started me over at the beginning there. So researchers think about a variety of different scales when they study streams and the physical habitat conditions of streams. The largest is the catchment or watershed scale, so that's shown over here on the left. That would consider the entire network of all the different rivers that contribute to that catchment or watershed. We then have progressively smaller sections of streams that researchers might be interested in studying, including a reach system or even microhabitats, which would include things like leaf packs or areas of sand or even a fine gravel patch. At that largest scale, I mentioned the term watershed or catchment. So this is a term that applies to the entire area of land where water and sediment is draining to a collective point. So the watershed divide is the line that delineates where the slope of the landscape is causing all of the water and the sediment to drain to the same place. In this diagram, you can see that that water and sediment is moving through a variety of landscape types as it moves from high elevation to low elevation, including through things like agriculture or even urban settings. This becomes potentially important because the sediment in the water that you see at the stream reach where you're located did not originate there. It's coming from somewhere upstream, and it's important to remember and think about the fact that the water and the sediment that you currently see may have passed through some interesting and important types of landscapes, including urban areas or agriculture, as it's moved from high up in the network to where you're located. We use a variety of terms to describe habitat types in rivers and streams. I'm just going to go over a few of those here, and some of these terms you've already heard. So riffles are relatively shallow areas where the water is moving fast over rock or gravel, and you can often characterize those types of sections of the stream because the water forms little white caps. Leaf packs are groups of decomposing vegetation that's submerged in the water, and you often find lots of macroinvertebrates living in leaf packs. Vegetated margins are areas along the edge of the water body that consist of overhanging bank vegetation, and that's important because it contributes leaf litter to the system. It also creates areas of shade and relatively cool temperature, which is important for things like macroinvertebrates and fish. Woody debris is a term you've already heard. This is dead or living trees, roots, limbs, or other submerged organic material. So essentially wood that's fallen from the terrestrial zone into the aquatic zone. And then of course the rock or the gravel stream bed is the area that has relatively coarse substrate. If we take a look at a typical stream, we see it has several important components that are critical to think about, especially as you do your habitat survey and describe the habitat where you're going to conduct your experiment. So the first thing to think about here is downstream versus upstream, and your left versus your right bank. Some people look downstream to define their left and right bank. Some people look upstream. It doesn't matter as long as you record and make a clear note of whether you call the left bank the left looking downstream or the left bank the left looking upstream. We also have some important geomorphic units here. The riffle, which I described previously as a relatively shallow, fast-moving area over rock or gravel substrate. A pool, which is a relatively deep area where the water is moving slowly. And a run is somewhere in between, an intermediate depth and intermediate water velocity. The stream bed, of course, is the area over which the water is flowing, and the fallway is the area of the stream channel where the water is the deepest. So it follows the course of the river channel where the water will be the deepest. These characteristics are important to describe because they may help you interpret or understand what patterns you see when you pull out and process your rock pack experiment.